Welcome to ND Love Story, where love stories are told with raw emotions and captivating storytelling. If you enjoy heartfelt and mesmerizing love stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to ND Love Story so you won't miss any episode. Ethan never thought that an ordinary evening could change everything. He sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of the golden lamp reflecting off the wooden table. Outside, the sky was a deep shade of blue, speckled with lonely stars. His parents had left not long ago, leaving the house in an eerie silence. A knock at the door pulled Ethan from his hazy thoughts. He stood up slowly, an unexplainable unease stirring in his chest. When he opened the door, a familiar figure stood there, Father Lucas. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, his tie neatly knotted, a Bible tucked under his arm. But something felt different. Lucas looked at him, his deep eyes scanning, searching for something unspoken. "Good evening, Ethan." His voice was low and steady. But there was something off, something too careful, too aware of itself. Ethan swallowed hard. "Good evening, Father. Are you looking for my parents?" Lucas shook his head slightly. "No, I just wanted to check on you." The words made Ethan's fingers unconsciously tighten. Lucas had always cared about him and his family, but he had never come just for him. A strange tension crept into the air. "Well, come in." Ethan stepped back, making way for Lucas. The older man walked in, his presence as firm and steady as always. But tonight, there was something different in the way he hesitated in the middle of the living room, as if he wasn't sure he should be here. A brief silence stretched between them. The soft ticking of the clock echoed through the stillness. Lucas inhaled deeply before sinking into the chair, loosening his tie as if it were suffocating him. "Have you been well?" His voice came out slightly rough. Ethan sat across from him, confusion and something else swirling inside him. "Yes, it's just that you seem different today." Lucas looked up at him, his eyes suddenly too close, too direct. "Different how?" Ethan swallowed. "I don't know, I just feel like you're thinking about something." Lucas didn't answer right away. He just sat there, silent, his gaze trailing over Ethan's face, lingering too long in places it shouldn't, his sharp jawline, the way his lips pressed together, the way his pale fingers rested tensely against his knee. A soft breeze slipped in through the window, making the candlelight flicker. And then, unexpectedly, Lucas reached out. A fleeting touch. His fingertips brushed lightly against Ethan's wrist, so light, so brief, yet it sent a shudder through his entire body. Ethan froze, his heart hammering so hard he swore Lucas could hear it. Lucas realized it too. His hand trembled slightly, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes darkened with something dangerous, something raw, something he had been trying to suppress. And then, just as quickly, he pulled away, his hand curled into a fist. "I shouldn't be here." His voice was barely more than a whisper, as if he was speaking more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan couldn't let him leave. "Then why haven't you left?" Lucas took in a sharp breath, as if the question had struck him in a place he had been trying to ignore. But instead of answering, he stood abruptly, turned, and walked out the door. Ethan sat there, watching his figure disappear into the night. And he knew this was only the beginning. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Lucas's touch. It had been too fragile, too brief, yet too real, a sensation that had rushed through his skin, burrowing deep into his mind, refusing to be ignored. And more than anything, he remembered Lucas's eyes, the way they had been filled with conflict, torn between pulling away and lingering just a little longer. But after that night, Lucas disappeared. He no longer stopped by Ethan's house as he used to. He no longer met Ethan's gaze when standing at the pulpit. He was still there, but it was as if he had built an invisible wall between them. And that made it hard for Ethan to breathe. Sunday evening, inside the silent church, Ethan sat in his usual pew. The congregation listened attentively to the sermon, but he wasn't paying attention. His eyes were fixed on Lucas, on a Lucas who was desperately trying to conceal his unease beneath a mask of composure. "Temptation will come when you least expect it." Lucas's deep voice resonated through the air. "Steady as always. It will test your faith, shake the very foundations of what you believe to be right." For the briefest moment, his gaze flickered toward Ethan. Ethan held his breath. It was just a split second, but it was enough to send his heartbeat into a frenzy. Enough to tell him that this sermon wasn't for the congregation. It was for him, for Lucas himself. Anger curled inside Ethan's chest. If there was nothing between them, why was Lucas running? Why was he using these words to fight something he clearly felt? Ethan couldn't stand it anymore. He stood abruptly, walking out of the church before the sermon had even finished. The night air was freezing, but not nearly as cold as the turmoil raging inside him. Ethan stood under the golden glow of the street lamp, inhaling deeply, trying to calm the tightness in his chest. But then, a voice behind him. "Ethan." He turned. Lucas stood there under the dim church lights, his crisp black dress shirt immaculate. But his breathing was uneven. His eyes were dark, stormy, like he was caught between two choices. "Are you running from me, Father?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling just slightly. Lucas clenched his fists, as if it were the only thing keeping him together. "I thought it was the right thing to do." Ethan took a step closer, leaving just a breath of space between them. "And, are you sure?" Lucas didn't answer, but his eyes had already said everything. Ethan didn't get an answer. Lucas just stood there, frozen, as if Ethan had cornered him into a place he had spent years avoiding. His breaths came fast and uneven, his dark eyes clouded with emotions he could no longer hide. But instead of admitting it, instead of facing it, Lucas took a step back. "You don't understand, Ethan." His voice was hoarse, strained. "This isn't something I can choose." Ethan's chest tightened. "Can't, or won't." Lucas inhaled sharply, a flicker of pain crossing his face. But instead of answering, he turned away, walking into the night without another word. Ethan stood there, watching his silhouette disappear into the darkness. A cold breeze swept through the empty streets, but it wasn't nearly as cold as the ache spreading inside him. Lucas was running, and that only meant one thing. He felt it too. Blank. Blank. In the days that followed, Lucas was nowhere to be found. Not at the church, not on the path where he usually took his evening walks. He had disappeared, slipping out of reach as if he had never been there at all. But avoiding the truth wouldn't change it. When Sunday arrived, Ethan sat in his usual pew, staring up at the pulpit. But this time, he wasn't listening. Lucas stood there, calm and composed as always. But Ethan saw it, the small cracks in his carefully crafted mask. The way his fingers gripped the Bible just a little too tightly, as if he needed to ground himself. The way his voice wavered, just barely, when his eyes met Ethan's for the briefest second. And sometimes, the greatest trials do not come from the outside world, but from within our own hearts. Lucas spoke the words clearly, but his gaze flickered toward Ethan for just a moment, a second too long, and Ethan saw it. The struggle, the battle Lucas was fighting with himself. The way he was trying, desperately, to forget. But Ethan refused to forget. He stood up, right in the middle of the sermon. Without hesitation, without looking back, he walked out. He didn't have to see Lucas's face to know, his voice had faltered. He had noticed. And this wasn't over. If Lucas was going to keep running, then Ethan would be the one to pull him back. Ethan didn't go home after leaving the church. He walked through the night, letting the cold wind brush against his skin, letting the storm inside his mind settle. But he knew one thing for certain: Lucas couldn't run forever. And he was right. When Ethan returned, Lucas was there. The tall figure stood on the porch, no longer carrying the stern, unwavering presence of a priest. His dark dress shirt was wrinkled, the collar slightly undone, his usually neat hair slightly disheveled, like he had spent the entire night fighting a battle within himself. Ethan stopped, his heart slamming against his ribs. Lucas looked at him too. His deep, stormy eyes unreadable, full of conflict, full of hesitation, and full of something far more dangerous. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice no longer that of a boy seeking guidance. It was steady, firm, a challenge. Lucas inhaled deeply, his hands clenching at his sides. "I don't know." Ethan let out a quiet scoff, but his pulse was erratic. "You don't know? Or you're just afraid of knowing the answer?" Lucas said nothing. He just stood there, staring at Ethan for far too long. Then, suddenly, he moved closer. Too close. The distance between them disappeared, leaving only heat, only breath. Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from Lucas, could see every flicker of hesitation in his eyes. And for the first time, Lucas didn't step away. "Ethan?" His voice was low, rough, like a man on the edge of a decision he couldn't take back. Ethan swallowed hard, but he didn't waver. If you truly don't want this, then tell me. He held Lucas's gaze, unwavering, unshaken. Look me in the eyes and tell me you don't feel anything. Lucas closed his eyes for a second, as if offering one last desperate prayer, as if searching for the strength to deny the undeniable. But when he opened them, everything crumbled, and then, he kissed him, not gently, not cautiously, but fiercely, desperately, like a man who had held himself back for too long and couldn't take another second of it. Ethan froze for a moment, breath stolen, but then he let go. He clutched onto Lucas's shirt, pulling him in, pressing into the heat, into the fire that had been burning between them all along. Lucas trembled as his hands found Ethan's waist, drawing him in like he couldn't bear even an inch of distance. This was wrong. This was forbidden. This was everything Lucas wasn't allowed to have. But he couldn't stop. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. Lucas still held Ethan, their foreheads pressed together, their breaths mingling in the night air. "We can't do this," Lucas whispered, but there was no real conviction in his voice. Ethan smiled softly, fire still burning in his eyes. "But you can't stop, can you?" Lucas shut his eyes tight and held Ethan just a little closer. "No, I can't." Lucas released Ethan, but only just enough to look him in the eyes. His breath was heavy, ragged, like a man who had just fought a battle he already knew he would lose. His expression was chaos itself, torn between what was right and what his heart so desperately craved. Ethan didn't back down. He met Lucas's gaze head on, his eyes bright and unwavering in the dark, as if he, too, was fighting against everything just to hold on to this moment. "Do you want to stop?" Ethan whispered, his voice as soft as the night breeze, yet carrying a weight neither of them could ignore. Lucas swallowed hard. "I have to stop," but his hands were still on Ethan's waist, and he still hadn't let go. Ethan let out a quiet, breathy laugh, shaking his head. "Tell me the truth." Lucas clenched his eyes shut, searching for the words that would make this easier. But when he finally spoke, the truth slipped out before he could stop it. "I can't." And then, he pulled Ethan back in. This kiss wasn't like before. It wasn't rushed, desperate, reckless. This time, it was slow, deep, lingering, as if Lucas was memorizing every second, every breath, every shiver that ran through Ethan's body, as if he wanted to carve this moment into himself, to hold onto it forever, because some part of him knew he wasn't allowed to have it. Ethan clutched at his shirt, his body burning, but inside, he was terrified. Terrified that Lucas would leave again, that he would deny this, that he would run. And Ethan was right. Just seconds later, Lucas broke the kiss. He inhaled sharply, stepping back as if he had been caught doing something unforgivable. His hand ran over his face, his fingers trembling. "We can't," he murmured, but this time, his voice wavered. Ethan could feel it, the distance between them widening. He couldn't let that happen. He stepped forward, grabbing Lucas's wrist. "Then why did you kiss me?" he whispered. Lucas exhaled shakily, closing his eyes. "Because I can't fight it." Ethan's grip tightened. "Then stop fighting." Lucas looked at him, and for one agonizing second, Ethan thought he might surrender. But then, Lucas ripped his hand away. He turned, and this time, he really ran. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The feeling of Lucas's lips was still burned into his skin, the softest touch. The heat of his breath, all of it haunted him. But more than anything, it was the way Lucas had left, hurried, chaotic, as if one more second in Ethan's presence would have shattered the last of his control. He couldn't let this end like that. At midnight, Ethan left his house. His steps carried him down a path he knew too well, a path leading to the only place Lucas could be. Lucas's house sat at the edge of town, a small but sturdy home, much like the man himself. But tonight, Lucas was no longer the steady, unshakable priest. Ethan knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. From inside, there was a sound, a shift of movement, a heavy breath, a silence that stretched far too long. And then, the door cracked open. Lucas stood there, his dress shirt wrinkled, the top buttons undone. His usually neat hair was slightly tousled, like he had spent hours running his hands through it, trapped in a battle with himself. But what caught Ethan's attention most were his eyes filled with pain, fear, and something even more dangerous. "Ethan," his voice was rough, barely holding together the strength he had always tried to maintain. Ethan swallowed hard, locking eyes with him. Tell me you don't want me here. If that's true, I'll leave. Lucas stared at him, lips parting like he wanted to say something. But he didn't, because it would be a lie. Ethan stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The door clicked shut behind him. Neither of them spoke, only silence, only the weight of everything left unsaid. Then, slowly, Lucas exhaled, a deep, heavy breath, full of exhaustion. He closed his eyes, as if offering one final prayer. And when he opened them, he gave in. Lucas lifted a trembling hand, his fingertips grazing Ethan's cheek. And this time, he didn't pull away. Lucas's hand brushed against Ethan's cheek, slow and tentative, as if he were touching something he had spent a lifetime believing he could never have. Ethan didn't move. He simply stood there, letting Lucas's warmth seep into his skin, letting the tremble in his fingertips say everything his lips refused to. How long have you been waiting for this? Lucas whispered, his voice hoarse, weary, yet filled with too much emotion to be contained. Ethan smiled faintly, tilting his head slightly, pressing into Lucas's palm, longer than I'd ever admit. Lucas inhaled deeply, his fingers tightening just slightly, as if he were afraid that if he let go, this would all disappear. But this time, he didn't run. This time, he didn't let fear dictate his choices. Ethan rose onto his toes. And for the third time that night, Lucas kissed him. But this time, it was different. No more desperation, no more struggle. This was surrender. This was acceptance. Lucas's arms wrapped around Ethan, pulling him in, holding onto him as if letting go would shatter the world itself. Ethan clung to him just as tightly, feeling the steady, powerful beat of Lucas's heart, knowing that for once, Lucas wasn't running anymore. They didn't know how long they stood there. Seconds. Or maybe, forever. Finally, Lucas pulled back slightly, his gaze softer, but serious. I can't keep living like this. Ethan. Ethan's heart clenched. Are you leaving again? Lucas shook his head. No. He exhaled slowly. I mean, I can't keep living two lives. I've spent too much time running from the truth. It's time I choose my path. Ethan searched his face, hope swelling inside him. And what path is that? Lucas sighed, but this time, it wasn't exhaustion. It was relief. You. And Ethan knew, this time, Lucas was never going to run again. It was supposed to be innocent. Just family. Just casual conversations and meaningless jokes. But then he said something. Something that changed everything. A proposal I never saw coming. A choice I never thought I'd have to make. And when I said yes, I knew there was no turning back because some lines aren't meant to be crossed. And yet here we are. I never thought it would happen like this. I never thought he would be the one to say it because some things just aren't supposed to happen. Some lines should never be crossed. Some thoughts should stay buried. But that night when he looked at me, everything changed. And when he made the proposal, I said yes. I hadn't seen my cousin Adrian in years. We used to be close growing up. But life got in the way. Distance. Different schools. Different cities. Then suddenly we were both adults living separate lives. And then he showed up at my door. It was supposed to be a short visit. A weekend at my place catching up. Reminiscing. Sharing drinks. Nothing more. Nothing unusual. But from the moment I saw him again, I knew something was different. He wasn't the same guy the first remembered from our teenage years. He was taller, sharper, more confident, and when he smiled at me for the first time in years, something in my chest tightened. We spent the first night talking, laughing about stupid childhood memories, trading stories about our lives, drinking more than we probably should have. And then at some point, the conversation shifted, the tone changed. His gaze lingered longer, his words got softer, and suddenly I felt it. Something dangerous, something I shouldn't be feeling. And then out of nowhere, he said it casual like it was nothing, like it wasn't about to change everything. You ever wonder what it'd be like? I frowned, my head spinning slightly from the alcohol. What would be like? He smirked, as if we weren't, cousin. Silence, the kind that stretched too long, the kind that felt louder than words. I should have laughed it off. I should have called him an idiot and changed the subject. But instead, I just stared at him because I knew what he was asking. I knew what he meant. And the worst part, I had wondered. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Adrian, I muttered, shaking my head. He leaned back against the couch, watching me with those unreadable gray eyes. I'm just saying, he murmured, tilting his head slightly. If things were different, you can't tell me you haven't thought about it. I should have denied it. But I didn't because in that moment I couldn't. The air between us was